I am going to introduce our speaker for MTS this week, Jeff Schank from UC Davis. This is our weekly meeting of the Minds, Technology, and Society series supported by the Glushko Foundation. Today's talk is also co-sponsored by our campus's NSF National Research Trainee Grant for Interdisciplinary Computational Graduate Education. Now that that's out of the way, it's really exciting to introduce Jeff. Jeff has a PhD in Conceptual Foundations of Science from the University of Chicago. He did a postdoc in Biological Psychology at Indiana, and since then has been on the faculty in Psychology at UC Davis with appointments in graduate groups for Animal Behavior and Computer Science. Jeff does pretty sweeping research, including involving the application of complex systems techniques, especially agent-based models and some robotics, to a wide range of social systems, from gene regulatory networks, menstrual synchrony, the development of social cognition, collective animal behavior, the evolution of cooperation, and the evolution of play. Jeff was also so kind as to admit me to the UC Davis Psychology Department in 2007, for which I'm extremely grateful. So today, Jeff will be talking about the evolution of fairness.
And ever since I had Paul, I was always hoping to have brothers or sisters, younger ones that would follow him up. It wasn't that long. So you could feel free to interrupt me as I talk. That's fine with me. The interruptions don't bother me at all. So I just want to say something about the title. So it's towards a theory of the evolution of fairness, because I don't have a theory of the evolution of fairness. But my methodology is to generate virtual experiments of different problems in fairness, and then see what emerges to propose theoretical principles that may underlie the evolution of fairness. So with that, I just want to say a little bit about what I mean by fairness, because it has a lot of different meanings, but I'm not actually going to give you a definition. I'm just going to be concerned with fair treatment of others and fair distributions. So those are the two senses of fairness that I have in mind. It's kind of vague, but that also fits in with the title. And what I then plan to do is talk about three different examples that I think fit into this notion. So the examples are going to be data on the Dictator Game, blood meal sharing in vampire bats, and the evolution of fair play, which is social play in many mammals, and maybe even birds. So let me first say that I'm not going to talk about, even under this definition, all contexts of fairness. What I'm particularly interested in is altruistic fairness, by which I mean that if you do an analysis of the costs and benefits at the level of the individual strategy, so you have costs and benefits, that when you apply a generalized notion of Hamilton's rule, that this condition for the evolution of cooperation or social behavior in general fails. And I think I can show that with some examples. And fairness is a good example of this, where this rule isn't met. And so if it evolves, we need alternative explanations. So for those who don't know, the Dictator Game is a pretty simple game. You have two individuals, at least in a two-person case. One's a dictator, one's a recipient. Dictator has some resource, say money, and the dictator has to decide how to divide that up. And it's solely up to the dictator. The recipient must accept that sum. So it's not really a game in the sense of the game where there's alternative strategies. So it's pretty boring, actually, except when experiments are performed with it. So here is some data from a meta-analysis that was done in 2011 of a number of Dictator games that were conducted. And so the prediction for the Dictator game is pretty obvious. A dictator shouldn't offer anything. There's no leverage that the recipient has. But on average, dictators offer 30%, and depending on the experiment, the modal contribution is a 50-50 split. So why did they do that? Well, there's one model that I'm aware of out there that's attempted to explain that, and that was by Andre and Baumart. And what they do is, if recipients are less common than dictators in a population, recipients have information about how the dictator played, then recipients can choose those dictators and force dictators to give them maybe 50%, because if they don't, nobody plays with them, because there's less dictators. Yeah.
Does the dictator not get anything if no one plays with them, or they just keep getting?
No, that would be the ultimatum game. They get to keep it. I mean, that's why it's so boring in principle. I mean, a self-interested dictator should just keep it. There's no constraints.
No, I just, what I think Tim's question was, is in this model, if, in this case, this seems like it would only work if a
Oh,
dictator
yeah, I
doesn't
get
to
it.
play
Yeah,
well.
that's another assumption of this, that the dictators don't get to keep the money if somebody doesn't play with them. It's as though the game never occurred, so they're not accumulating payoff or resources.
Okay.
Yeah, I misunderstood.
Yeah. I guess if the dictator when they don't get anyone to play with them doesn't get any money, how is that different from the ultimatum game? Because they just have no play with them, so now they get no money anyway.
Yeah, I think it is. It sounds like it's somewhat, equivalent to an ultimatum game. It doesn't work. It doesn't explain behavior in the dictator game. I completely agree. And I was just going to point out another problem with it is that in dictator games, players are anonymous. This is to control for a variety of other effects. So even the context in which a market type of situation as proposed in that model doesn't even apply. So there haven't been any models of the dictator game. So I want to start off with just a hypothetical example of dictators in two kinds of dictators in two kinds of populations. So you have one population of dictators that are absolutely fair. And so when an agent's a dictator, it shares a resource. Say if the resource is $10, it gives its recipient partner $5. Another population where the dictators behave completely self-interestedly and they keep the resource. Now, let's suppose in this hypothetically constructed population that we watch their behavior through a number of time steps. And so on each time step, half of the players are randomly selected to be dictators in each group. But every agent can be a dictator. But then they are also a recipient, and it's purely by chance. So we know what the expected payoff for the population of fair agents. That's going to be half the resource, say $5. In the long run, though, for the agents that are completely selfish but randomly taking turns being a dictator, their expected payoff is exactly the same, 5. So when you look at it from the point of view of expected payoffs, there's absolutely no difference between the two populations. It doesn't make any difference. And the Hamiltonian equation that I showed you earlier is violated. But that's not the only statistical parameter we can look at. Suppose we consider the variance in payoffs among individuals in the population. So we can, for this hypothetical population, which they take turns, we can calculate the variance. And so what this graph down here is the proportion that's offered by a dictator. So completely self-interested dictator offers 0. And altruist is completely selfless, offers everything. And what we see is that as the variance deviates from 0, which is giving 0.5, the variance increases at the extremes. So we do know one thing, that these populations differ in the variance among individuals on each step of play, and that variance will accumulate. So when I encounter a problem like that, I like to create virtual experiments. And my approach is I like to use, at least generically, biologically realistic agents. So these agents will be able to reproduce, they'll play other agents, they'll accumulate resources. As they accumulate sufficient resources, they can reproduce, and they invest in offspring. This is typical of, to some extent, at least for mammals, and I think most multicellular organisms follow this kind of pattern. So let me tell you about the simple model that I'm missing something. This must not be quite the version that yeah, it'll do. No, I had changed some slides a little bit. I was a little bit thrown off. Anyway, so we're going to look at agents in a two-dimensional discrete space. They're going to be mobile agents. They can move randomly in their environment, one step at a time. So we're going to allow them to aggregate in space. This is a basic condition for social behavior. They'll reproduce locally, that is, if they have an offspring, it'll be right next to them. They have a lifespan that will sign that there'll be variability in it. They have to reach a specified quantity of resources to reproduce. Resources are acquired by playing the Dictator game with other agents that are next to them. And we introduce reproduction, which will be asexual in this case. There'll be heritability of the proportion of a resource that they offer with mutation, parental investments, and to control for population density, which is important, we have a population carrying capacity. So this is just an event diagram, and if you want a copy of the talk, I'd be happy to give you copies of it. But this just describes all the decisions and events that happen on each step of play. And for purposes of time, I'm just going to skip over this, but just show you that there's a number of steps that happen on each round of play. And so, when you run an individual simulation, we start out with all the agents spread out randomly in space, and they're all selfish. And then we allow them to evolve early on they kind of aggregate together. Yeah.
Sorry if you said this already and I missed it, but when if an agent dies at a particular stage, is the agent replaced by exactly one replacement or one descendant, or does the number of descendants vary, or?
It can vary. If it dies, it can be replaced by another offspring from another agent. So it's possible for the population to fluctuate a bit. Okay. And then as simulation goes on, they change color, which I'll explain in a minute, and that's because they're evolving. So more detail. So this is an illustration of what a simulation looks like graphically. So you see agents moving around, you see colors changing. So what's happening, this is fairly late into a simulation, like 50,000 steps into it. And you see blue and purple and red areas. So the bluer are 50% or slightly more fair agents. The purple are getting close to 50%, maybe a little less. And then the red are self-interested agents. Now, the interesting thing, I'm going to go into some data, is this is pretty much what this looks like at stability. They don't evolve to just one type. You get a mixture, which I think is interesting because in real data from experiments, you get different responses. You get people that are self-interested and also fair, and that occurs in all experiments. So here is sort of the illustration of the time course. So we have what the population looks like, and then at the top we have the amount proposed that evolves, and the blue line is the empirical meta mean that I showed you earlier. And we see that the populations fluctuate a lot, and for this size of population with only 250, there's a lot of fluctuations, but it fluctuates about, for these set of parameter values, around the mean. So what we did is we conducted a number of simulation experiments changing different parameters to see what the effects would be. So we did multi-level selection experiments. And what I mean by multi-level is that when you put agents and allow them to group together, actually different levels of selection emerge from their interactions. So to control for that, if you're doing a virtual experiment, you need a control. We do individual level only experiments. And the way you can do that is just at each time step you swap agents randomly. So you preserve spatial structure and you just move agents from one place to the other, so they're not playing other agents that they're surrounded by. It's essentially random play. And then group level simulations, which are like my hypothetical example that I talked about earlier, where you have two different populations. You let them to compete, and if there's no difference, then you should just see random extinction over time of one group or the other. But if there's a difference, you'll see a bias towards one kind of group with a particular level of fairness, for sure. So here is the overall results. So we have a number of lines. They correspond to different parameter values from how much they invest in offspring and how much resources they can store. And what we see here along the horizontal axis is the density of the population. So you can have populations of different density, and so, you know, complete, when the density is 1, every single cell in the space is occupied. And so what we see at the top is that for low density, around 0 to 2%, well, it's going to be higher than 0, that many of the simulation results are near the mean, the empirical mean. Some are above, some are below. And the dark black line is the mean of the simulations. The point of this comparison is to show that this kind of model produces plausible results that are consistent with the empirical data for relatively low density. As the density increases, the level of sharing decreases, or fairness. The second one is the individual level simulations. And what happens when they're swapped, basically the proportion that's offered is 1 to 5%, which is primarily driven by the mutation rate. So they're behaving essentially self-interestedly when you swap them. When they're allowed to aggregate, then for low densities where you don't have crowding of groups, they can produce sharing or fairness behavior that's consistent with the empirical data. Then the third set of simulations were group levels. So we have two groups. On the left here is completely fair dictators. They always share. On the right are completely self-interested. We let the two groups compete. That is, there's a carrying capacity of 250 agents. They can reproduce whenever below the carrying capacity. And so one group goes extinct pretty quickly when they're competing against the fair agents, which indicates that something is going on at the level of groups or aggregates. And this is the corresponding basically fitness landscapes for systematic varying from providing 0 to giving it all, such as the selfless. And what we see is that the peak fitness is at 0.5 with respect to group selection.
Could you explain a little bit how they are playing the game in the simulation? Are they playing with each other?
Yes, what they're in these simulations. So when an agent's located in space, it can play any of the 8 agents that are immediately sort of next to it.
So what happens if two dictators are in contact?
When they
If two dictators are in contact, greedy dictators.
well, what happens is that an agent is a dictator by chance, and so they're not dictators as a property. So on each round of play, one agent is selected randomly, and it looks around at the nearest agent to choose a recipient. They only play once. Yeah.
And how does the competition between groups work? Because the two groups are not directly...
They're not. The competition is at the level of how many offspring they're producing. So the groups of fair agents outproduce groups of unfair or self-interested agents.
So what if there's heritability in the type? So dictators are more likely to produce. Suppose dictator was a type.
Yeah.
It's originally randomly assigned, but then maybe there's heritability in that, depending on fitness or something like that. What would that do to the solution?
Well, I'm not sure. It depends how you would set that up. You could have agents that are dictators and not, and see how the proportion changes. I'm going to guess that they're not going to do so well in this kind of simulation, but I don't know exactly. Yeah.
So just 2 quick questions on the properties of the agents. If you could go back to that chart where you showed the flow of how they make their decisions, like who, do I play a game with my neighbor, or do I die at this moment, or
Yeah.
what were the conditions for reproducing? So
Oh, the conditions for reproducing were one to have, well, there were actually three conditions. One condition was having sufficient resources, let's say 100 units of resource. The next condition was that the number of agents in the population was below the carrying capacity, otherwise they can't reproduce, and that there is an open space next to them. So they can't necessarily reproduce every time they want to. But whether an agent gets the opportunity is random. So there's no bias introduced by that.
And with regards to that opportunity, is it at all dependent upon their success at the game? So does the amount of energy that they have when they assess whether or not they get to reproduce, is that after they make some sort of energy exchange, or is it independent from the games that they're playing?
Let's see. Well, the amount of energy does not influence their chance to reproduce.
Oh.
Their chance to reproduce is purely random, and it only depends on meeting those conditions and having enough resource. So what happens, what the advantage to fair agents, as I'm going to get to in a second, is that they're more likely to have reached that threshold, even though the expected payoff for them is the same. And let me show you why. So here's a diagram to illustrate what the mechanism is going on. So on the left we have no fairness. So the agents are red. They keep everything they have. And at the bottom, these are their offspring that they produce. And of course, they can provide them more resources. But you see, unlucky agents may not accumulate in a given amount of time sufficient resources. The fair agents, they are sharing some of their resources at an expense to themselves. And other agents that aren't so lucky, like the third one on the right, by interacting with fair agents, gets enough resources. So what happens when agents are allowed to aggregate and they tend to play other agents with the same strategy, and they are distributed resources, is that you get a more efficient distribution of the resources into offspring at the level of the social unit that is formed. And this is a principle that underlies, I think, fairness in a lot of systems.
I'm curious if this might change if you had a much higher threshold for them to have to meet in terms of how many resources they need to have in order to have kids. Because then it seems like if you have much more variance in the no fairness condition, then the tails will be fatter on the distribution, so you might have more people in the extreme end if you had a very high limit for what you need to have in order for to be able to produce offspring at all.
Yes, I mean, there are conditions under which this will fail. If for example, for this particular case, if the resources are highly variable, but not necessarily, we're going to come back to an example like that, then it's possible that the best strategy is to keep it all, because it's just not likely that you're going to accumulate enough resources by sharing to make it. Okay. Let's jump on to something fun. So now I want to turn to vampire bats, and instead of looking at the fecundity side of fitness on the offspring, let's look at the survival side and fairness, because those are two different components to fitness. So vampire bats are really interesting. So They're not topical animals, they're tropical animals, distributed throughout Mexico, Central and South America. They've been around a long time. So humans, we've been around for about 200,000 years. The bats have been around for, these common vampire bats, for about 2.5 million years. So whatever they're doing is pretty successful. So they feed, the common vampire bat feeds exclusively on mammalian blood. There's 2 other species that feed on birds. And they really like horses in particular. So they drink as much as they can. So they have actually the fastest kidneys of any mammal. So they start drinking blood, and within a couple minutes, they're urinating constantly. Because they're trying to take in so much blood and they can't fly off if they don't get rid of some of that water. So the success, this is only one study though, it's been that for adults over 2 years, 93% of the time they're successful when they go out at night. And younger bats are not so successful. They live a long time, at least 18 years, often. And in the wild, a pair have been observed together for 12 years. So they're living in the wild for a long time as well. Interestingly, they don't live long without feeding. So a blood meal will last them about 60 hours. So if they go 2 nights without feeding, they're going to starve to death in general. So throughout the year, this is definitely not the one I wanted. Okay, anyway. So females reproduce about every 10 to 12 months. They reproduce throughout the year. Somehow here got this deleted. Males leave the groups at about 12 months to 18 months of age. They live by themselves. Yeah. Females, they live in social groups of about 8 to 12 females. The populations can vary considerably in size, and they often live in hollow trees, but they can live in large caves. But if they do, the females in social groups associate with each other and not with others. Males, they go live off on their own, form male hierarchies. The females then go visit the males for mating. Females mostly share blood meals with their offspring, but they will share them with other starving females in the social group. And interestingly, when genetic analyses have been done, the association, the relatedness with bats that they share with is pretty close to 0. So these groups are made up, they do have sisters in them, but they also have a lot of unrelated female bats. So these are all female groups, and sharing with relatives is not it's not exclusive. In fact, they share about equally with non-relatives.
Does sharing entitle like not fighting them off when they come near your prey, or like bringing them nutrients?
Oh, basically when they share, they regurgitate blood.
Okay, so it's
And
a process of like bringing nutrients to them sometimes.
Yeah, so the ones that have been successful, they fly back to the social group, and a starving female next to her will prompt her to feed her, and she will feed them.
Is there reciprocity?
Well,
If I share?
that's a good
Okay.
question. That has been the classical story, and I was going to show you a quick little video to illustrate that. So I'm going to get to that question in a minute. So one thing that I want to highlight is that in the laboratory, it takes a long time for a female to be accepted into the social group. Nobody's made a big deal about that. But I think it's really important for the success of the system. Oh, and the male bats almost never will share a blood meal with another, which leaves me with the question, how long do males in their social groups live? Because we're going to see that theoretically, these groups can't last long without sharing. So the question is, why do they share blood? So this is the classical account. It's about 3 minutes long. Oh, we don't have the sound up, do we? Do we have sound for this?
Question.
I don't
You know.
Usually there's like a plug-in.
Yeah, I do have the plug-in, but
Did you ever hear you plug it in? So,
if not, I can just tell you what's.
There's an option for audio on, maybe something like that.
audio, laptop.
And squabble
Oh,
between
here.
pair of animals striving to maintain their position within their community are common enough. But acts of assistance in which one adult animal goes to the aid of another that's got itself into difficulties, these are much rarer. But this sort of behavior does seem to occur regularly in one species of animal, a colony of which is living in this hollow tree. It's not an animal that might immediately come to mind as an example of a caring, unselfish creature. And that apparently is what it is. On this pile of droppings, there are flecks of congealed blood, characteristic sign of vampire bats. And the colony itself is roosting above me. These bats, all females, habitually roost as a group. If they move elsewhere, they will stick together and hang in the same sort of arrangement. Most are related, although by no means all. But every bat knows her regular companions well. At night, they fly off to look for blood. A donkey is a favorite target. One lands on its shoulder and shaves a slice of skin without the donkey even noticing. Another goes for its ear. The bat's saliva contains an ingredient that prevents blood from clotting, and it flows freely from the wound they make. A third bat tries a different point of attack. The bat on the ground still hasn't got a hold, but it's very hungry and it makes one last attempt. But no, she won't feed tonight. On returning to the roost, she hangs up beside an old friend. She turns to her neighbour and licks her face repeatedly, begging for food. If she goes hungry for more than a day or two, she will die. But her friend regurgitates enough life-giving blood to keep her going until the following day. On another night, the situation may be reversed, and the bat that is receiving now will repay the gift if it's needed. But cheats, bats that refuse to give to a neighbour who once helped them, will quickly be detected and in consequence may never be helped again. So for a vampire, it pays to help your neighbours, whether they're related or not. Look after them, and they will look after you.
The last point is really interesting because there's absolutely no data, and the main people who've done this, that reciprocity is enforced. As much as they've looked, they cannot find that if a bat refuses, that she'll be refused by the same bat later. I mean, they do find that there's a tendency for bats to associate with each other and to share more with those in the social group they associate with. But that's pretty weak when you actually look at the data as well. So there really is no evidence that they engage in reciprocity.
I mean, what kind of data is available? Is there a lot of large bat studies on group
No, there's only
reciprocity?
basically a guy named Wilkinson and Carter, who've done all of the research over the years with vampire bats, starting in the 1980s. And they're still intensively doing it, mostly in the lab these days. So we really, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me like the only way that community enforcement could possibly work is if all the bats in the community knew who a cheater was. And
Yeah.
that seems like that. I think even if one betrayed bat knew which former partner cheated, how would the rest of the community know?
Yeah, that's a good point, because in their experimental work, they find that a bat can get blood from up to 7 donors in a night. So there's a lot of possibilities. That's good points. So what I did is create another virtual experiment using what we know about vampire bats. And the strategy is, let's build in what they do. Let's let them evolve a level of blood sharing and see what happens. See if they do evolve it. Rather than, I'm not making any particular theoretical assumptions. So in outline, we're going to have, I modeled adults and their offspring. I modeled groups of 12 to start with. That'll be the average size. Each step in the model is a day, so I'm just going to model a whole day at a time and run through the various steps. Females can reproduce every 10 to 12 months. So I did simulations of both 10 months and 12 months. It's because in the literature, some claim they reproduce an offspring about every 10 months, another a year. Does it make any difference? Not much. Agent bats will die in this model if they don't receive a blood donation that will last them the next 24 hours. So I model blood in terms of hours of survival. So a blood meal, the base blood meal is 60 hours. And here is a diagram. So if they're too old, they die. If they're question is they're fed. If they're fed, if they are, they might feed another one that hasn't been fed, or they might beg. After this step, do they have enough resources to survive the next day, to the next day? If not, they die. Then we ask, can they reproduce? Is 10 months gone by and they can reproduce, or 12 months they can reproduce another offspring? That's the simple model of what happens on a daily basis. The problem is they live in these social groups, so we have to handle groups in the model. And we don't know how groups end. So I figure that there's basically 3 general ways groups can end. They could just all die out, extinction. They could, when they get really small, they might fuse with another group, or simply migrate out randomly to different groups. So I simulated all 3 types of endings. Turns out it didn't much matter. Oh, among bats, there's a low rate of migration. So the empirically observed, they migrate about a new migrant enters the group about every 2 years on average. So in these simulations, there were a maximum of 100 groups with an average size of 12. This is what happens if they don't share blood. So we start out, this is the number of years, and we start out populations of 100. What I've done here is the blue line is 93% success rate. That's the only empirical study we have. I looked at different success rates that were lower, 90% all the way down to 65%. This other looked at a question that hasn't been looked at, but we know there's a lot of variation in the size of blood meals that come back. So I introduced normal standard deviation of 0 to 12 hours. Of course, you increase the variation, you increase the likelihood of dying. So what we see here is that at a 93% success rate, these groups are going to die out by 3 years. And if the success rate's lower, they go out a lot faster. They can die in just a month or two with really bad success rates. And if there's a lot of variation in the size of blood meals, they might not do so well either. So we know that they cannot survive without blood sharing, at least the way their physiology has evolved for handling blood. They don't store fat. So here is a simulation with just the empirically reported parameters. So 93% success rate. On the top graph A, the different simulations represent fission, fusion, fission extinction, and fission migration. And what happens is we start them out at very low, I think 5% sharing. If we start them out at 0, the populations go extinct too fast with these parameter values, so we start them out at 5%. And they evolve to actually higher than the empirically predicted amount is about to share about 20% of a blood meal. That's what they estimate in the lab, is what they're sharing with a starving female who will get her to the next day. Under these conditions, they evolve slightly higher, 22 or 23%, which is kind of surprising. Though it is really a function of that there's just not really high selection on this for this success rate. The next graph is the variance. This is to kind of illustrates where the selection is coming from. So the blue line is the between variance of groups in sharing. So that's pretty high. And then the black and red line are respectively the total variance in blood sharing and the within group variance. Now the interesting thing that I found with this, I expected the between group to be high. Those groups that share are going to survive. But the within is only 90% of the total variance, which indicates that there's a lot of variation within these groups. It's pretty close to the total variance. So these groups aren't evolving towards kin selection. They are evolving towards sharing. And then this last graph is what the average number of donors are in these simulations. So they, when they evolve to this level, on average, a bat has about 1.5 donors. Okay, so that's one question. So it's quite possible for sharing to evolve, just given the description. But what I'm not taking into account is what I call smart cheats. In a certain sense, when you think about the original problem, a bat that stays in a group can't be a cheat. Because if it's a cheat, its roostmates die, its group goes extinct, and it kills itself in the long run. Well, what about smart cheats? So you can imagine a cheating bat that takes advantage of a nice healthy group, and if the numbers go down a little bit, it just flies to another group and parasitizes it. So I simulated smart cheats that could have a viable strategy to get the best of both worlds. They keep all their blood, reduce their risk of dying, and they fly on. So what happens? Well, to my surprise, Actually, smart cheats, still populations can resist these bats. What we have here is the rate at which cheats enter groups. And this is in terms of months. 24 is the reported migration rate. Then I looked at 21 all the way down to 3. And it has to get a pretty high rate before you get these groups going extinct. So what these graphs are cumulative frequency plots. So on the right we have 93.9, 85, and we have variation in meal size in the second half. And then these are the frequency of sharing bats, and we stack them one on top of the other so they're color coded. So you can see in one graph what's happening. So if there's no waiting period, they can just enter a group. It starts knocking them out, you know, especially if they're under pretty harsh selection due to low foraging success. But they can persist under even higher levels. But then, if we consider one of the characteristics that's been established but not really made a big point of, is that these bats don't readily accept other bats. So in the laboratory of Carter and Wilkinson, what they find is that when they put a new bat in, you know, they don't kick the bat out. They just won't share blood if it's starving. And they don't know exactly how long, but they tested it out up to 2 months, and they still don't accept after 2 months, and they think it might be a year or more. So what I did is I tested out a 6-month waiting period. And so if you make a migrant bat a cheat wait 6 months, well, except for the very highest migration rates, groups can resist them and persist. And maybe that's their mechanism for dealing with cheats, is simply not to accept others into the group. Well, accept them, but don't share with them until they've established social relations with them. You would say mutual grooming and things like that. So I want to do one more simulation.
Can I ask, during the probationary period, do these bats that are not accepted, do they share? Do they need to like prove themselves to be pro-social bats? Or?
These the cheats never share.
Okay, they never share.
They never share.
They're not even trying to mimic the.
No, the only way they survive is just to be successful going out there. They try to get it from others, but they won't.
So it's like an antisocial type.
The
Okay.
cheats are, yeah.
Okay.
But what about in the lab studies? When they try to introduce the new bat, does the new bat share?
You know, they never reported that. They just were looking at whether anyone would share with them. Of course, they weren't looking at the question of cheats. I just took the fact that they don't readily accept them into their social group as a possible explanation. Rather than looking for reciprocity, maybe they handle it at the group level. We just don't let somebody in. We force them to that. See what happens if you join a group and you can't join for 6 months, you're going 6 months without that insurance of a blood meal if you're unlucky. So it's a way of making a migrant show that they are willing to join the group.
So I may have missed this, but how does heritability work in these simulations? Do the offspring have the same phenotype as their parents, or are they?
Yeah, what I did, I didn't model sexual, so it's asexual. So they inherit the offer level of their parent, female, and then there's a mutation rate which introduces random mutations into. So it could increase by a little bit, decrease by a little bit with a mutation.
So your number of cheats or whatever could vary through this.
It could. See, so there can be two kinds of cheats. There can be the kind of cheat that just doesn't give very much, which does evolve but doesn't really prevent the evolution of sharing. And then there's the smart cheat, which can escape another group that may be going bad and invade another group.
So if this is too far off topic, feel free to dismiss it, but your previous graph of the starvation rate was showing that they, female bats need sharing to survive,
Yes.
basically, but
Yeah.
male bats don't share. So what's the difference? They have a higher success rate, or that?
No, the same data that reported, the same data on the success rate indicate, they said that there's not really any difference between males and females. And as I said, it's an open question to me. How did the males survive? I mean, I don't know. I kind of question that assumption, but they don't have any evidence that they share. How did they do it? Is there something different about males that we don't know? Of course, the males may be dying at a high rate and they're replenished by males from these female groups rapidly. I don't know. I was really interested in that, and I've scoured the literature and can't even come close to getting an answer to that one.
I have a question I think is related to some of this, which is I've heard that in some bat populations that they also cooperate in raising the pups. So they'll have a kind of babysitting model. Where one older bat will stay with the pups while the others hunt. And I was wondering if that happens with vampire bats, and if so, that playing a role.
I don't know. Females are more likely to share with any juveniles, including males.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be that level of blood sharing. So most of the episodes of blood meal sharing are with females to offspring, and not always their own.
I guess I was wondering if maybe one reason you would share with another female is because you have to rely on sometimes every female will have to stay back to be the babysitter. And maybe that could also explain
I don't know.
why
I don't know if in this.
time.
I haven't read or come across it that in this particular system that they're babysitters, or I think they.
You said that the females generally share with the juveniles. Is that because the juveniles are just less successful because they're only 67% successful, or is it because, or they actually have some preference for sharing with juveniles?
Oh, well, I think that, I don't know, I'd be speculating, but I suspect that they have a preference. They, of course, when their offspring are just born, they are completely dependent on, well, they're nursing their mother, and then they eventually start blood meal sharing about the time they can fly out. And they aren't as successful early on. So the females seem to take care of the females and male offspring at that stage. So my last example is social play, which is a new area I've been getting into. So many mammals and some birds, and people argue that a variety of other phyla have play in them, but clearly mammals engage in social play with their offspring do. And this has created a long-term problem. Why do animals engage in social play? Because it is costly. I mean, there have been studies done with some species of mammals, and there is an increased risk of predation from engaging in social play. There's certainly energy costs, which constrain play to occur when there are high energy situations for a population. And its functional significance is not really well understood. Though there have been hypotheses, and a well-known working hypothesis for social play is that it provides learning and refinement of skills needed as adults. Now, fair play, which I'm going to talk about today, is a special form of social play. And two characteristics that especially a guy named Beckhoff has pushed is play that involves self-handicapping and role reversals switching between dominant and submissive positions. So there is alternation that goes on. It doesn't have to be 50-50, but one playmate is not dominating the other. So and I'm not going to be able to, we don't have data to establish this, but we can ask the question, can learning to treat others fairly, can we model that to show that there could be benefits from doing that? Well, I bring up the example of mountain lions because about 2 weeks ago, there was a paper published, and to everyone's surprise, these solitary living adult lions, they often share a kill with another lion. So another lion comes in, there's some hissing and growling back and forth, and then they share it. In this particular case, from this picture, these two lions shared this carcass for about 2 days and around it. So one kills and allows the other one to share in the meal. And this turns out, at least in this population that was studied, quite common occurrence. There was only 13 lions studied, but only 1 or 2 of them didn't share with others. Now, I want to show you a quick video. These are 2 mountain lion cubs in the Cincinnati Zoo, and they're basically engaged in self-handicapping play and role reversal. So they engage in rough and tumble play, and they exchange up and down positions. And since mountain lions often have cubs, there is the opportunity for play to perhaps influence the adult behavior. Though I'm not going to model mountain lions today. I just wanted to illustrate what I'm talking about here, and that this kind of behavior is not limited to just primates. That even solitary living mammals may engage in food sharing. So what I'm going to do is create a model in which agents have 2 developmental stages. A juvenile stage where they can engage in social play and learn. If they engage in a sufficient number of bouts of play, they learn how to behave fairly as adults. And as adults, we're going to allow those who've learned how to play fairly in a social group to pool their resources with others who play fairly, and then divide those resources up at the end. So agents are going to live in small groups, though this particular model, group structure isn't absolutely crucial. Agents have 2 developmental stages, a juvenile and adult stage. Juveniles engage in social play. Otherwise, if they don't have the social play gene turned on, they don't do anything. They have to engage in at least M bouts of social play, so it's a real simple type of learning to learn how to play. And importantly, each time they engage in social play, there can be a cost, a mortality cost. There's a chance that they can die. So we're introducing a selection cost to engaging in social play. During the adult stage, reproduction is determined by resource acquisition. So adults obtain a resource R. They're not playing for this, they just randomly obtain it with a probability P. So they're going out foraging, and we just model the amount that they get and their success rate. And so their expected payoff is given by P times their expected resource. So adult agents that have learned to play fairly as adults, they pool their resources with others. So interestingly, with this model, those that pool versus those that keep it all have exactly the same expected payoff. So fair individuals that pool, they get PR. Selfish have an expected payoff over the long run of PR. The variance for fair individuals is 0 because they're putting it all in, and then they equally divide it up at the end of a round. However, the variance for selfish individuals, in this case, could be quite large. Here's some examples. So for a probability of obtaining a resource of 0.25 times 10 units, the variance can be 18.75. If it's 0.0625 times 40 equals, again, expected payoff of 50, the variance is a lot larger. So adult agents, they have to accumulate enough resources to pass a resource requirement threshold. Then the interesting thing that was added to this model is a simple constraint on reproduction. You can't engage in unlimited reproduction. If an agent reproduces, they have to wait the simulation steps to reproduce again. This is the basic idea. I mean, if you take a mother rat, she reproduces offspring about every 21, 22 days. What this constraint amounts to is you can't feed her twice as much and she reproduces every 10 or 11 days. So there's a gestation constraint placed on this. I'll get back to the reason why this is an interesting constraint. It's a realistic constraint, an essential constraint, and it makes a difference. So offspring play if they have a play gene and there's a mutation rate R in that gene, and parents invest in their offspring. I'm going to use a parental investment of 0.5 that actually produces the greatest fairness or sharing results. If you reduce that, fair play is less likely to evolve. So this is the event diagram. So it goes through what happens when they're juveniles and what happens when they're adults. I won't spend the time going through that for now. So let me show you some initial results. So what I did in the first set of simulations is I had populations of social groups, and the expected payoff in each case was 3.5, but I varied the resource quantity and the probability of success to get that 3.5. This way I could have the same expected payoffs, 3.5, and vary the variance in payoff. How often did they get a reward? And one of the things you have to do is run a control simulation, because if there's no selection on a play gene, then what's going to happen is random mutation is going to take it on average to 50% off, 50% on. When you have a really simple model in which there's one gene and it can either be on or off, you really have to know what the probabilities it'll evolve to by chance. So that's the dark line with the open circle, and you can see that when this is the social mortality rate, how often they die from engaging in play, and it ranges from 0, so no cost, of course, produces the best result, to 10% mortality. And we see that, for example, with the control at the very bottom, that at 0% mortality, we have 50% of the population with the play gene. As mortality goes up, but there's no selection benefit, that frequency goes down, but it only goes down to about 5% because if it gets really low, the gene is masqueraded from selection because there's not enough agents that have the gene to engage in play so they don't die. And so the mutation rate keeps it a certain way. So you need to run those simulations. But we see that for a variety of conditions, that if they engage in play and then split it, even though the expected payoffs are the same whether you share or not, they do better. And we see that it's connected with variance. So the lowest variance is the green dot here, and that's not too far above the control. And then as we go up to higher in variance, except when we get to really high variance, that it continues to increase. But this isn't the whole story. This is averaged over 50 different reproductive delays between reproduction. Let's plot this out in terms of reproductive delays from 0 to 50. The first graph on the left is the control. So you can see the black dotted lines are all at 50%, and then the others are lower. This is for a resource of 10. And we see that what happens is we have these peaks. So if the cost of mortality is fairly low, then reproductive delay doesn't make that much difference. But as it increases, only agents that are suffering the highest levels of mortality costs evolve at a delay of 15. And it turns out that this is all probabilistic. So 3.5 times 15 takes you, well, I'm not going to go through the calculations right now, but it's the quickest way to get to the reproductive threshold. And when you have low success rates, they don't quite do as well if they are not pooling their resources. So what we see is that in all these cases, that play that leads to pooling, even though the expected payoff is the same, results in the play gene evolving. This is just a particular experiment, simulation with, in this particular case, the resource size is 40, and the probability of obtaining the resource is pretty low. But we see that the play gene, even in the case of 10% mortality, reaches 80%. So when the variance is pretty high, pooling resources can be very beneficial. And I think for time and to leave for general discussion, I'm not going to discuss my last case because it's basically an interesting example of the first one. But I want to get to my conclusions from these three different cases. I think that we can begin, or at least I would like to propose it, three different principles. The first one is that in these situations where you have social situations that evolve either through aggregation or individuals living in groups, that it's not merely the expected payoffs for employing strategies that matter, but at the social level, variance in payoffs begins to matter. And reducing that variance be beneficial for individuals living in a social unit where they they share or fairly distribute resources, resources are more efficiently converted into offspring. So if you're an individual living in a social group, you have a greater likelihood of producing more offspring from being in that context. Population structure, especially, of course, I haven't explored the problem of cheats in the case of social play, but it's a natural extension to look at, which we could talk about. But population structure matters. Somehow keeping cheats away or aggregating with those that don't cheat is a way of maintaining fairness in, but not the only way, in the face of possible cheating. And then biological constraints, I believe, are very important. So in the case of converting resources into offspring, constraints on the flow are very important. I mean, none of this works if an agent or individual can take in unlimited resource and produce unlimited offspring as rapidly as possible. So this only works if there's some type of constraint on the flow of resources into offspring. And one of the more natural ones that is unavoidable is development or gestation in the case of offspring. So where is my slide? You know, oh yeah, this is what I wanted. I had this earlier because I wanted to show this before. So Paul and Matt Miller worked on developing the Dictator Game model. And I got to thank Matt for discussing issues with the vampire app model, and then Gordon Burkhardt and Serge Pellis for their contributions to the development of the social play model. They know a lot more about social play than I do, because they've been working on it for years. And so they were really helpful in developing that. So I'll leave it there.